The Wyoming Badlands stretched like scar tissue across the high desert, all broken rock and sagebrush, and the particular emptiness that came from land too harsh for most people to love. Tom Avery stood at the fence line of what remained of his ranch, watching the sun climb over hills that held more secrets than water, and felt the familiar weight of solitude settle onto his shoulders like dust that never quite washed clean. He was 53 years old and looked older, weathered by grief and isolation, and the slow erosion of purpose that happened when you lost the things that made waking up feel necessary. His wife Anne had died 4 years ago, cancer that moved faster than hope, and the cattle business had died with her, sold off piece by piece until all that remained was 40 acres and a barn that echoed with the ghosts of better days. Tom had learned to live with silence, had made peace with being alone, except for the horses he kept out of habit more than need. But some mornings, standing in the pre-dawn cold with coffee that tasted like obligation, he wondered if peace was just another word for giving up. The gelding appeared on a Tuesday morning in late September, standing by the highway fence like he'd been placed there deliberately, all ribs and matted coat and eyes that held the particular wariness of creatures who'd learned that humans were unpredictable at best and cruel at worst. Tom had driven past him twice before guilt made him stop, before the voice in his head that sounded like Anne said some things couldn't be ignored just because they were inconvenient. He'd coaxed the horse into his trailer with grain and patience, driven him back to the ranch, and spent 3 days just getting him comfortable enough to accept food and water without flinching. The gelding was a dun, buckskin color with a black mane and tail, maybe 10 years old, with scars on his legs and a brand that had been deliberately obscured, burned over with what looked like a hot iron applied carelessly. Tom named him Hickory because the horse's coat reminded him of the wood his grandfather had used to build furniture back when Tom was young enough to believe that things built with care lasted forever. The town of Prospect Ridge sat 15 miles from Tom's ranch, small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and big enough that secrets still managed to hide in plain sight. It was the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere else, unless they'd been born there and couldn't quite figure out how to leave. And it was the place that had been haunted for 7 years by a tragedy nobody could solve and nobody could forget. Evan Miles had been 8 years old when he disappeared during a family camping trip in the national forest that bordered the Badlands. One moment he'd been playing near the campsite while his parents set up their tent. The next moment he was gone, vanished like smoke, leaving behind only questions and the particular kind of grief that came from not knowing. The search had lasted for weeks. Volunteers had combed every inch of forest and canyon. Dogs had tracked scents that led nowhere. The FBI had investigated, interviewed, built profiles of everyone who'd been in the area. But Evan had simply ceased to exist, as if the land had opened up and swallowed him whole. His mother, Claire Miles, had never left Prospect Ridge. She ran a small bookstore on Main Street and lived in the same house where Evan's room remained exactly as he'd left it. Toys on shelves, clothes in drawers, a bed made, and waiting for a child who everyone except Claire had accepted was probably dead. The town carried that weight like a collective bruise that never quite healed. Every missing child report on the news brought it back. Every anniversary meant renewed media attention and reopened wounds. And every year that passed made hope feel more like delusion and acceptance feel like betrayal. Tom had known the Miles family peripherally, nodded to them at the feed store, exchanged pleasantries at the post office. But after Anne died and Tom retreated into isolation, even those small connections had frayed. He'd attended the early search efforts, but grief had made him useless for helping anyone else, and eventually he'd stopped trying. Now, standing in his barn watching Hickory eat hay with the methodical intensity of an animal who'd learned to value every meal, Tom thought about connections and coincidence, and the strange way the universe sometimes delivered exactly what you needed, disguised as something you didn't want. The first indication that Hickory was different from other horses came on a Thursday afternoon when Tom decided to check the fence lines near the old mining hills. The area had been abandoned for decades, played-out silver mines that had drawn prospectors in the 1800s and been sealed shut when the veins ran dry, and the economic calculations no longer justified the danger. Tom saddled Hickory for the first time, expecting resistance or at least uncertainty from a horse who clearly hadn't been ridden regularly. But the gelding accepted the saddle with calm that seemed almost eager, like he'd been waiting for purpose beyond just surviving. They rode out across the Badlands in companionable silence, Tom checking fence posts and gates, while Hickory moved with the steady confidence of a horse who knew rough terrain and didn't need constant direction. It was the kind of riding Tom had missed, partnership rather than domination, two creatures working together toward a goal neither could accomplish alone. But when they reached the area near the sealed mine entrances, concrete barriers and warning signs that had faded to illegibility, Hickory stopped dead. Not a gradual slowing, a complete freeze, every muscle locked, ears pinned back, whites of his eyes showing. Tom felt the horse's body go rigid beneath him, felt the trembling that started in Hickory's shoulders and spread through, his entire frame like he was confronting something that triggered memories too terrible to process. "Easy," Tom said, his voice low and soothing. "What is it, boy? What's got you spooked?" But Hickory wasn't listening. The gelding's nostrils were flaring, testing air for scents Tom's human nose couldn't detect. His head swung toward the nearest mine entrance, a concrete sealed shaft with a rusted gate that hadn't been opened in Tom's lifetime. And then, in a movement so sudden it nearly unseated Tom, Hickory lunged forward, not away from the mine, toward it. Tom pulled on the reins, trying to regain control, but Hickory was beyond responding to commands. The horse moved with desperate purpose, pulling toward the sealed entrance, his hooves striking rock with sounds that echoed against the canyon walls. He stopped at the concrete barrier and began pawing the ground, a sound that was part frustration and part something Tom couldn't quite identify. Terror, recognition, urgency. "Hickory, stop! There's nothing here. It's just an old mine." But even as Tom spoke, he felt the wrongness of the situation settle into his bones. Horses didn't behave like this without reason. Animals sense things humans missed, predators, weather, danger that operated on frequencies beyond human perception. Tom dismounted carefully, keeping hold of Hickory's reins while the horse continued his agitated movements. And that's when he noticed them. Footprints, fresh ones, pressed into the dust near the mine entrance, leading not away from the sealed shaft, but toward a section of hillside that looked undisturbed except for the faint outline of what might have been a ventilation pipe, half buried and deliberately concealed. Tom's heartbeat accelerated. The mine had been sealed for safety reasons. Unstable tunnels, toxic gas accumulation, the constant threat of collapse. Nobody should be near these entrances. Nobody should have any reason to be here at all. He moved closer to the ventilation pipe, and Hickory's agitation intensified. The horse was practically vibrating now, making sounds Tom had never heard from him. Whinnies that bordered on screams, punctuated by pawing that had become frantic. Tom knelt beside the pipe and pressed his ear against the opening. At first, he heard nothing except the amplified sound of his own breathing. But then, underneath it, barely audible, something that made his blood run cold. A sound. Human. Distant but unmistakable. Not quite a voice. More like movement. Like someone or something was down there in the darkness where nothing should be alive. Tom pulled out his phone with hands that shook slightly, dialing the sheriff's office with the particular dread of someone about to report something that would either be a false alarm or change everything. "Sheriff Carson, this is Tom Avery. I'm out by the old mining hills near Sector 12. I need you to send someone out here. I think there might be someone in the sealed mines." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds that felt like an hour. "Tom, those mines have been sealed for 30 years. You probably heard an animal, maybe a coyote den or... It's not an animal, and my horse, he's acting strange. Really strange, like he knows something's wrong here. Please, just send someone to check." Another pause. Then Sheriff Michael Carson's voice came back, professional but skeptical. "I'll drive out. Give me 20 minutes. But Tom, if this turns out to be nothing, I'm going to have some questions about why you're wasting law enforcement time." "Fair enough. I'll wait here." Tom ended the call and returned to Hickory, who had calmed slightly but remained fixated on the mine entrance with an intensity that suggested this wasn't random fear or curiosity. This was recognition. This was a horse who knew something Tom didn't, who was trying to communicate in the only language available to creatures without words. "What do you know, boy?" Tom whispered, resting his hand on Hickory's neck and feeling the rapid heartbeat beneath skin and muscle. "What are you trying to tell me?" Hickory turned his head and looked directly at Tom, and in those dark eyes, Tom saw something that made him understand. This wasn't about instinct or animal behavior. This was about purpose. This was about a horse who'd come to Tom's ranch for a reason, who'd led him to this specific place at this specific time because there was something here that needed finding. And whatever it was, it had been hidden for a very long time. The sun continued its arc across the Wyoming sky, painting the Badlands in shades of amber and shadow, and Tom stood with an abandoned horse at a sealed mine entrance, waiting for answers that would shatter 7 years of silence and prove that some mysteries didn't stay buried forever. They just waited for the right guide to lead the desperate back to truth. Sheriff Michael Carson arrived 35 minutes later in a dusty patrol vehicle, accompanied by Deputy Rachel Hayes, both of them wearing expressions that suggested they expected to find a nervous rancher jumping at shadows rather than anything requiring actual investigation. Michael was in his 50s, career law enforcement, with the particular weariness that came from seeing too much of what humans did to each other and having to maintain faith in society anyway. He climbed out of the vehicle and approached Tom with hands on his belt, a posture that broadcast skepticism without quite crossing into hostility. "All right, Tom, show me what's got you concerned." Tom led them to the ventilation pipe, Hickory following closely, still agitated but slightly calmer now that reinforcements had arrived. "Listen," Tom said, gesturing to the pipe. "Put your ear against it and tell me what you hear." Michael knelt, his expression suggesting he was humoring a civilian who didn't understand how sound traveled through abandoned mine systems, creating echoes and false impressions that meant nothing. But when he pressed his ear to the opening, something changed in his face. The skepticism flickered, the professional mask cracked slightly. He pulled back and looked at Rachel. "There's something down there. Movement. Maybe breathing." "Animal?" Rachel suggested, though her voice held less certainty than the word implied. "Maybe, but—" Michael stood and studied the area around the mine entrance, his trained eyes picking up details Tom had noticed but hadn't fully processed. The footprints, the disturbed earth near the ventilation pipe, the way the concrete seal on the main shaft had been chipped at recently, fresh marks suggesting someone had been testing its integrity. "This mine was sealed in 1985, Michael said slowly. The company that owned it went bankrupt, and the county condemned the entire network. There's supposed to be no way in or out except through this main entrance, which has been blocked for 30 years. "Supposed to be," Tom repeated. "But that pipe's been cleaned recently, and those footprints are fresh. Someone's been here. And my horse," he gestured to Hickory, who had resumed his pawing behavior. "He's acting like he recognizes this place, like he's trying to tell us something." Michael pulled out his radio and called back to the station. "I need a technical team out at the old Sector 12 mines. Bring the drone and thermal imaging, and get me property records for this area. I want to know if there are any structures or access points we don't know about." Rachel was walking the perimeter, her flashlight playing over rock and scrub brush, looking for anything that might explain what they were hearing. She stopped suddenly, 20 feet from the main entrance, her light fixed on something Tom couldn't see from his angle. "Sheriff, you need to look at this." They moved to where she stood, and Tom felt his stomach drop. What had looked like natural rock formation was actually a carefully constructed false wall, stones stacked and mortared to blend with the surrounding hillside, but upon closer inspection, clearly man-made, and at the base, partially hidden by sagebrush, was a metal grate that had been recently removed and carelessly replaced. "That's a secondary entrance," Michael said, his voice tight with the realization that this had just become something serious. "Someone's been living in these mines, or hiding something, or—" He stopped, the thought too horrible to complete, but hanging in the air like smoke. The technical team arrived 40 minutes later with equipment that looked expensive and official, a drone small enough to navigate tight spaces, thermal cameras, communication gear. The lead technician was a young man named David who approached the situation with the focused intensity of someone who had trained for emergencies but rarely encountered them in rural Wyoming. "We can send the drone in through this secondary entrance," David explained, setting up his equipment. "The thermal camera will pick up any heat signatures, animals, humans, whatever's down there. The mine system extends about 2 miles underground, so this might take a while." "Do it," Michael ordered. They watched on David's laptop screen as the drone entered the darkness, its lights cutting through blackness that had existed undisturbed for decades. The camera showed tunnel walls, support beams that had partially collapsed, sections where the ceiling had dropped loose rock onto the floor. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, an abandoned mine system, dangerous and empty. But Hickory didn't agree. The horse had moved closer to the entrance, his ears pricked forward, his entire body oriented toward the opening, like he was listening to something the humans couldn't hear. And when the drone had been underground for about 15 minutes, Hickory suddenly reared up and screamed, a sound so loud and distressed that everyone jumped. "Jesus," Rachel muttered. "What the hell was that?" Tom approached Hickory, speaking softly, trying to calm the gelding, but Hickory pulled away and moved to the entrance, pawing frantically now, his distress escalating to the point where Tom worried the horse might hurt himself. "Sheriff," David said quietly, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen. "I've got a heat signature, human-sized, moving." Everyone crowded around the screen. The thermal image showed a figure, small, hunched, moving through a tunnel section about a quarter-mile underground. The movement was slow, deliberate, like someone navigating in near-complete darkness. "Can you get closer?" Michael asked, his voice tense. David maneuvered the drone through a narrow passage, the camera zooming in as much as the low light allowed. And then the figure turned toward the drone's light. And for just a moment, they saw a face, young, male, pale from lack of sunlight, eyes reflecting the drone's LED with an expression that cycled through confusion, fear, and something that might have been hope. Rachel gasped. "Is that—" "Can't be," Michael interrupted, but his voice held uncertainty. "Tom, back that drone out, now. Rachel, get me Claire Miles on the phone. Tell her we might have found something, but don't give her details yet. And call the state police. We need backup." "Sheriff, what's going on?" Tom asked, though pieces were starting to connect in his mind. The age of the boy, the location, the 7 years that had passed since Evan Miles disappeared. "That boy down there," Michael said carefully, "matches the description of Evan Miles, which should be impossible because Evan disappeared 7 years ago from a campsite 40 miles from here, and we've had search teams comb this entire area multiple times." "But it's possible," Rachel said, already dialing her phone. "If someone took him, kept him hidden, used these mine tunnels as—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, because finishing it meant acknowledging evil that was too calculated, too sustained to process easily. The drone pulled back, and David switched to a wider angle, trying to map the tunnel system and determine the best access point. That's when the thermal camera picked up a second heat signature. Larger, adult-sized, moving with purpose toward where the boy had been spotted. "There's someone else down there," David said, "and they're heading toward that kid." Michael's hand went to his weapon, and Tom saw the sheriff's entire demeanor shift from investigation to tactical response. "Rachel, tell state police we have a potential hostage situation. Tom, I need you to back away from this area. This is now an active—" He was interrupted by a sound that echoed from the mine entrance, a voice, male, shouting something unintelligible but clearly hostile. Then a gunshot, the report amplified by tunnel acoustics into something that sounded like a cannon. Everyone dropped instinctively, seeking cover behind vehicles and rock formations. Hickory reared again, but this time he didn't flee. He wheeled toward the entrance, his ears pinned back, his entire body language shifting from fear to something that looked almost like aggression. "Armed suspect in the mines," Michael radioed. "I repeat, armed suspect. Do not approach the entrance. Establish a perimeter and wait for tactical support." But Tom wasn't thinking about perimeters or tactical support. He was thinking about a boy who'd been underground for 7 years, who just heard gunfire, who was trapped in darkness with someone violent. And he was thinking about Hickory, whose behavior had evolved from fear to recognition to active distress. "Sheriff," Tom said carefully, "I think my horse knows that boy." Michael looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "What?" "I think Hickory recognizes something about this place, about what's down there. Animals remember things, scents, sounds, places. What if—" Tom stopped, the theory forming faster than he could articulate it. "What if this horse belonged to Evan Miles, before he disappeared?" Rachel pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen, searching for information from 7 years ago. "The family had a foal," she said suddenly, reading from an old news article. "The report mentions it briefly. Claire Miles had bought a yearling colt for Evan's birthday. The horse went missing from their property around the same time Evan disappeared. Everyone assumed it wandered off or was stolen by opportunists. But what if? What if whoever took Evan also took his horse, Michael finished, and kept them together, underground? The implications crashed over them like a wave. A boy and his horse, imprisoned in mine tunnels for 7 years by someone who'd somehow evaded every search effort, every investigation, every technological attempt to find them. It was the kind of scenario that seemed impossible until it was staring you in the face, demanding to be believed. More gunshots echoed from the mines. Closer now. And then a voice, clearer this time, shouting threats about trespassers and government tyranny and defending what was his. The unmistakable rhetoric of someone who'd retreated from society so completely that reality had warped around their isolation into something unrecognizable. Survivalist, Michael muttered. Probably been using these tunnels for years. Off-grid, paranoid, and somehow he grabbed that boy during the camping trip and he stopped, overwhelmed by the logistics and psychological implications. Tom was watching Hickory, seeing how the horse's attention remained fixed on the mine entrance, how his ears tracked sounds humans couldn't hear, how his entire body vibrated with the need to act. And Tom made a decision that was equal parts instinct and desperate faith in connections he didn't fully understand. He walked to Hickory and began removing the halter. Michael started to protest, but Tom raised his hand for silence. "Listen to me," Tom said quietly, speaking as much to himself as to the gathered law enforcement. "This horse knows that boy. He's been trying to tell us since we got here, and if there's any chance at all, that he can help." He pulled the halter free and rested his hand against Hickory's neck, feeling the rapid heartbeat, the tension, the barely restrained need to move. "Go find your boy," Tom whispered. "Go bring him home." And he stepped back, releasing the horse completely. For a moment, Hickory stood frozen, processing his freedom, the trust Tom had just placed in him. Then he turned toward the mine entrance and began to move, not running, walking with purpose and certainty, disappearing into the darkness like he was finally fulfilling a mission he'd been carrying since the day someone had stolen him away from a child who'd loved him. The assembled law enforcement stood in stunned silence, watching a horse voluntarily enter a dangerous situation because a rancher had believed in a connection that couldn't be quantified or proven. "Sir," Rachel said carefully, "did that just happen?" Michael didn't answer. He was listening to the sounds coming from the mine, the echo of hoofbeats on stone, the change in acoustics as Hickory moved deeper into the tunnels, and then, barely audible but unmistakable, a new sound, a boy's voice, screaming, not in fear, in recognition. The scream that came from the mine wasn't terror. It was recognition turned into sound, the primal expression of a child who'd been alone in darkness for 7 years, suddenly hearing something that meant safety, that meant home, that meant the nightmare might finally be ending. "Hickory!" The name echoed from the depths, amplified and distorted by tunnel acoustics, but clear enough that everyone standing at the entrance understood what they were hearing. Evan Miles, wherever he was in that maze of abandoned passages, had recognized his horse. And that recognition had given him the courage to announce his presence, to risk the violence of his captor, to hope that rescue was finally, impossibly within reach. "Move in," Michael ordered, his training overriding the impossibility of what they were witnessing. "Tactical approach, armed suspect underground. Priority is the boy's safety. Rachel, coordinate with state police. David, keep that drone active and map every movement you can." But Tom wasn't listening to the tactical planning. He was listening to the sounds from the mine, the thunder of hoofbeats as Hickory moved deeper into the darkness, the boy's voice calling again, and then another sound that made Tom's blood freeze. An adult male voice, angry and desperate, shouting about property and rights and a world that had no understanding of freedom, punctuated by more gunfire that echoed like the earth itself was crying out. "He's shooting at the horse," Rachel said, horror in her voice. "Or warning us away," Michael replied, but his expression showed the same fear, that they'd come this close to rescuing Evan Miles only to have the situation end in violence that would traumatize everyone involved beyond recovery. The tactical team from state police arrived in an armored vehicle, 6 officers in full gear, who approached the mine entrance with the practiced efficiency of people who'd trained for hostage situations, but rarely encountered them in rural Wyoming, where most crises involve drunk drivers or domestic disputes rather than children imprisoned in abandoned mines. The team leader, a woman named Captain Stevens, assessed the situation quickly. "How many suspects?" "One that we know of," Michael answered. "Adult male, armed, appears to be experiencing mental health crisis. He's been living in these tunnels, possibly for years. We believe he's holding an 8-year-old boy." He corrected himself. "A 15-year-old boy now, who was taken 7 years ago." Stevens processed this without visible emotion, though Tom saw her jaw tighten. "And the horse?" "Belonged to the victim, went into the mine voluntarily. The boy recognized it, used the horse's presence to alert us to his location." "That's—" Stevens stopped, unable to find words for what that was. "All right, we're going in. But this is delicate. If the suspect harms the boy or the horse, we lose all leverage. Our priority is getting them both out alive." She turned to her team, issuing orders that involve formations and communication protocols and emergency medical standing by. But before they could move, Hickory emerged from the mine entrance, not alone. The horse was moving slowly, carefully, and pressed against his side, clinging to his mane with hands so thin they looked like they belonged to a skeleton, was a boy who'd been 8 when he disappeared and was now 15, though his body hadn't quite caught up with the years. He was pale as death, his eyes squinting against daylight he hadn't seen properly in 7 years, wearing clothes that were a patchwork of materials clearly scavenged from someone's survivalist. Supplies? But he was alive, conscious, walking, and he was holding on to Hickory like the horse was the only solid thing in a reality that had just become more overwhelming than the darkness he was leaving behind. "Cover them," Stevens ordered, and her team moved to create a protective barrier between the mine entrance and the boy. Weapons trained on the darkness in case the suspect emerged in pursuit. But no one followed. The gunfire had stopped. The angry shouting had ceased. There was only silence from the tunnels, as if the mine itself had decided this particular story didn't need to end in more violence. Medical personnel rushed forward with blankets and equipment, but Evan flinched away from everyone except the horse. He pressed closer to Hickory, his face buried in the gelding's mane, and made sounds that weren't quite words, just vocalizations that communicated he wasn't ready yet for human contact. That the only safe thing in his expanded world was this animal who'd remembered him, who'd come back for him, who'd led rescuers to a prison no one had known existed. Tom approached slowly, hands visible, moving with the same patience he'd used when first bringing Hickory to the ranch. "Evan," he said quietly, not sure if the boy could hear him or process his voice. "My name is Tom. I'm the one who's been taking care of Hickory. He showed me where you were. He never forgot you." Evan's eyes, brown like his mother's, though Tom had only met Claire Miles a handful of times, focused on Tom with an intensity that suggested he was trying to determine if this was real or just another hallucination brought on by isolation and trauma. "He came back?" Evan's voice was hoarse, unpracticed, the vocal cords of someone who'd spoken only to himself and his captor for 7 years. "He really came back for me?" "He did. He led me right to you, like he knew you were waiting. I always told him someone would come, that we'd get out someday. I promised him." Evan's grip on Hickory's mane tightened. "I promised we'd both get out." The medical team tried again to approach, and this time Evan allowed it, though he kept one hand on Hickory the entire time they wrapped him in the thermal blankets and checked his vital signs. He was malnourished, but not critically so. Dehydrated, vitamin deficient, but alive and conscious and surprisingly intact, considering he'd spent 7 years underground. "We need to transport him to the hospital," the paramedic said. "Full evaluation. He's going to need—" "The horse comes with me." Evan's voice was stronger now, the authority of someone who'd survived impossible circumstances and had no intention of being separated from his lifeline. "Hickory comes with me, or I don't go." Stevens looked at Michael, who looked at Tom, who understood that sometimes regulations and procedures needed to bend around the reality of what trauma required for healing. "I'll trailer him," Tom said. "Follow the ambulance to the hospital. The horse can. Stay in their parking lot or wherever they have space. But Evan's right. They shouldn't be separated. Not yet." The paramedics stabilized Evan enough for transport, loading him into the ambulance with remarkable gentleness, and Tom led Hickory back to his trailer. The horse loaded without resistance, like he understood his job wasn't finished yet, that getting into the trailer was just the next step in bringing his boy all the way home. As Tom started his truck to follow the ambulance, Sheriff Michael approached his window. "The suspect is still down there. We're sealing the mine and waiting him out. But Tom, what you did today, what that horse did. I've been in law enforcement 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it. You saved that boy's life." "Hickory saved him," Tom corrected. "I just listened when he tried to tell me something was wrong. Still, the town's going to want to know the story. The media is going to swarm. Are you ready for that?" Tom thought about the quiet life he'd built after Anne died, the isolation he'd chosen because grief was easier to manage alone. And he thought about Hickory and Evan and connections that transcended understanding but demanded to be honored anyway. "I don't need recognition," Tom said. "I just want that boy to heal and his horse to stay with him while he does." At the hospital in Casper, an hour's drive from Prospect Ridge, Claire Miles was waiting. Tom had heard her arrive in the helicopter before the ambulance even pulled up, her urgency transmitted through every frequency available. She was younger than Tom expected, maybe 40, with hair that had gone prematurely gray from 7 years of not knowing, and eyes that held every emotion simultaneously: hope and terror and disbelief and desperate need. When they brought Evan out of the ambulance, Claire's knees buckled. She would have fallen if Rachel Hayes, who'd ridden with them, hadn't caught her. "That's him," Claire whispered. "That's my baby. Oh God, that's my baby." Evan saw her, and something broke in his face. All the strength he'd been showing crumbled, and he was 8 years old again, crying for his mother, reaching for her with arms that couldn't quite coordinate after years of limited movement and poor nutrition. They came together in a collision of grief and relief, both of them sobbing, both of them unable to speak because words couldn't touch what they were feeling. And Hickory stood in Tom's trailer 20 feet away, his head over the door, watching the reunion with ears pricked forward like he understood that his part in this story had led to exactly this moment. The investigation that followed consumed weeks. The survivalist, a man named Leonard Marsh, who'd been living off-grid for 15 years, had taken Evan during the camping trip, believing he was rescuing the boy from a corrupt world. He'd kept him in an elaborate tunnel system he'd spent years developing, teaching him survivalist skills and conspiracy theories, creating a reality where the outside world was the danger and the mine was safety. The horse had been taken because Evan had been inconsolable without him, crying for days until Leonard had stolen the colt from the Miles property and brought him underground too. For 7 years, boy and horse had been each other's company, evidence that even in the darkest circumstances, connection provided a reason to survive. Leonard was arrested when tactical teams finally breached the deeper tunnels. He surrendered without additional violence, muttering about his mission to save children from society's corruption. The psychological evaluation would determine his fitness for trial, but everyone involved knew that whatever judgment came, nothing would restore the 7 years he'd stolen. Tom visited Evan at the hospital every day during the 2 weeks of his initial recovery. The boy was physically healing faster than expected, his young body responding to proper nutrition and medical care with remarkable resilience. But the psychological trauma would take years to process, and Evan clung to Hickory's presence like a lifeline. They'd set up a temporary arrangement in the hospital's maintenance area where Hickory could be stabled, close enough that Evan could visit multiple times per day. The boy would sit with the horse for hours, brushing his coat, talking softly about the years they'd spent together in darkness, about how Hickory had been his only friend, his only source of warmth, the only thing that reminded him he wasn't completely alone. "He saved me," Evan told Tom during one visit. "Not just now, all the years. When I thought I'd go crazy from the loneliness, Hickory was there. When Leonard would get angry and I'd get scared, Hickory would stand between us. He protected me. For 7 years, he protected me." "And then he protected you one more time," Tom said, "by finding me, by refusing to move past that mine until I understood something was wrong. He never stopped trying to get you out." Evan looked at Tom with eyes that held more understanding than 15-year-olds should possess. "Leonard used to say the outside world would never look for me, that everyone had forgotten. But Hickory didn't forget. He waited until he could escape, and then he found help. He's smarter than any person I've ever met. He loves you. That's what smart looks like when it cares about someone." Claire approached as they were talking, carrying papers that Tom recognized as ownership documents. She'd been handling the logistics of Evan's return. medical decisions, legal proceedings, the overwhelming task of reintegrating a child into a world he barely remembered. "Tom," she said, her voice carrying the weight of impossible gratitude, "I've been trying to figure out how to thank you for what you did, for listening to Hickory, for believing something was wrong, but there aren't words big enough. You don't need to thank me. I do, and I need to do something else." She held out the papers. "These are Hickory's ownership documents. When he was stolen, I kept them. Always hoped I'd need them again someday. And now," she paused, emotion threatening to overwhelm her again. "Now I want to sign them over to you." "What? No, he's Evan's horse. He belongs with Evan." "He belongs with both of you," Claire corrected. "Evan told me what you did, how you took in a neglected horse nobody else wanted, how you treated him with patience and kindness, how you listened when he was trying to communicate something everyone else would have ignored." She pressed the papers into Tom's hand. "Hickory brought our son back, but you're the reason Hickory was able to do that. So I'm asking you to share ownership, to help us figure out what comes next. Because Evan needs support rebuilding his life, and Hickory needs someone who understands him. And I think maybe you need them too." Tom looked at the papers, then at Evan, who was watching this exchange with an expression that suggested he'd been hoping for exactly this outcome. "Are you sure?" Tom asked the boy. "You saved us both," Evan said simply. "And you gave Hickory a home when he needed one. That makes you family, and family shares." 6 months later, Tom stood at the fence of what had once been his failing ranch, and was now something else entirely, a place with purpose beyond just surviving. Claire had used the reward money and settlement from various sources to fund the construction of a small therapy facility, a barn, paddocks, a covered arena, and a house where families could stay while their children worked through trauma using horses as partners in healing. They called it Second Chance Ranch. The name had been Evan's idea. The facility specialized in working with children who'd experienced trauma, not just kidnapping victims, though those were welcomed, but any child who'd been broken by circumstances and needed help becoming whole again. Hickory was the heart of the program, a horse who understood fear and isolation and the long road back to trust because he'd walked it himself. Evan was the first therapy client, though he preferred the term partner in recovery. He rode Hickory every day, the two of them working through their shared trauma by simply being together, by remembering that they'd survived the impossible and could face whatever came next as long as they faced it together. Tom had become the ranch manager, moving from his isolated property to this new place that hummed with life and purpose. Claire ran the administrative side while Tom handled the horses and the day-to-day operations. It wasn't a romantic partnership. They were both too scarred by their respective losses for that. But it was a functional family built on shared mission rather than traditional structures. On the 6-month anniversary of Evan's rescue, they held a small ceremony at the ranch. The media had lost interest after the initial sensational coverage, which suited everyone involved fine. This wasn't about publicity. It was about marking a milestone in healing. Sheriff Michael was there, along with Rachel and most of the law enforcement personnel who'd been involved in the rescue. Captain Stevens had brought her team, saying they needed to see the positive outcome that justified the trauma of that day. And scattered throughout the small crowd were families whose children would be the next clients of Second Chance Ranch. People who'd heard about what Hickory had done and believed that maybe, just maybe, their own broken children could find healing through horses who understood brokenness. Tom stood with Hickory while Evan addressed the gathered group, the boy's voice stronger now, his body filled out from proper nutrition, though the shadows under his eyes suggested nightmares still visited regularly. "People keep calling Hickory a hero," Evan said, "and I guess he is. But that makes it sound like what he did was unusual. Like horses don't normally care about the people they love, but Hickory cared about me every single day for 7 years. He kept me warm when it was cold. He let me talk to him when I needed to hear my own voice. He protected me when Leonard got angry, and when he finally got free, he didn't just run away and enjoy his freedom. He found someone who would listen, and he led them back to me." Evan walked to Hickory and wrapped his arms around the horse's neck. "That's not heroic. That's just what love looks like when it has 4 legs and doesn't know how to give up on people." He stepped back, and Tom saw tears on the boy's face, but also strength, the kind that came from surviving darkness and choosing to believe in light anyway. "So, This ranch isn't about celebrating one rescue, Evan continued. It's about believing that healing is possible, that broken things can be fixed if you give them time and patience and refuse to accept that some damage is permanent. Hickory taught me that, and Tom proved it by giving Hickory a chance when everyone else saw a worthless horse that should be put down. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a plaque at the ranch entrance. It bore Hickory's name and a simple inscription: "Sometimes the abandoned find exactly who needs them most." That evening, after everyone had left and the ranch settled into the quiet routine of evening chores, Tom and Evan groomed Hickory together in the barn. The horse stood patiently, clearly enjoying the attention, occasionally nuzzling Evan's shoulder or Tom's hand in the particular way horses showed affection. "Do you think he understands what he did?" Evan asked, running a brush over Hickory's shoulder. "Do horses comprehend significance like humans do?" "I don't know," Tom admitted, "but I think he understands love and loyalty, and that some connections matter more than comfort or safety or logic. He chose to find help instead of just enjoying his freedom. That's not instinct, that's decision-making based on caring about someone more than yourself." "He saved both of us, you know," Evan said quietly. "You were alone too. After your wife died, you were isolating, giving up, and Hickory gave you a reason to connect again, to care about something beyond just surviving day to day." Tom looked at this teenager who'd been forced to grow up in darkness, but had somehow retained the ability to see clearly, to understand truths that most adults spent lifetimes avoiding. "You're right. He did save me, just like he saved you. Maybe that's his purpose, finding broken things and refusing to let them stay broken." They finished grooming in comfortable silence, and when Hickory was settled in his stall with hay and water, Tom and Evan stood at the barn door watching the sun set over the Wyoming Badlands, the same harsh landscape where 7 years ago a boy had been stolen and a horse had been taken to keep him company, where impossible suffering had somehow transformed into impossible healing, where the abandoned had found each other and created something that looked suspiciously like redemption. "Thank you," Evan said suddenly, "for listening to him, for believing something was wrong even when it didn't make sense, for not being like everyone else who would have just assumed he was spooked and moved on." "I almost did move on," Tom confessed. "Almost ignored him. But something Anne used to say kept coming back to me. Pay attention when things that shouldn't care about you act like they do. Hickory cared about something. I just had to figure out what. And you did. And everything changed." They stood watching the day fade into night, two souls who'd been lost and were still finding their way back, but doing it together with the help of a horse who'd proven that sometimes the most damaged creatures carried within them the capacity for the most extraordinary heroism, not the loud, dramatic kind that made headlines, but the quiet, persistent kind that showed up every day and refused to abandon those who needed saving. In his stall, Hickory finished his hay and rested his head over the door, looking out at the darkening sky with the calm satisfaction of an animal who'd completed his mission and found peace in the accomplishment. He'd been neglected, abandoned, scarred by circumstances he couldn't control, but he'd remembered, he'd persisted, and he'd proven that love, whether human or equine, had the power to endure impossible darkness and emerge into light on the other side. The boy had been missing for 7 years, but he'd been found because an abandoned horse refused to let him stay lost. And from that impossible rescue had grown something even more impossible. A place where other broken things could come and learn that their damage wasn't permanent, that healing was possible, and that sometimes salvation arrived on 4 legs, carrying nothing except loyalty and the stubborn refusal to give up on those who mattered most. The stars emerged one by one, the same stars, that had watched over a boy trapped underground and a horse searching for help, and the Wyoming Badlands, harsh and unforgiving as ever, held within them now a ranch dedicated to proving that second chances weren't just possible, but necessary, and that the abandoned often proved to be exactly what the lost needed most to find their way home.